Shaquille O'Neal did a tour of Greece for the NBA,
Mhm.
and someone asked him, "Hey, how did you enjoy the Parthenon?" And he said, "I didn't go clubbing in Greece." And everyone made fun of him, but little did he know, he's actually a prophet and
Whoa.
foresaw the Nachde Nashville after party.
This
is
The
Bhangra Podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Bhangra Podcast. Today we're talking to the judges of Nachde Nashville 2022, Naina, Pooja, and Umer. Howie was unable to record in time because he's a Voodoo Friday. Also, just a note, we did have to record some of the judges, specifically Naina, separately from Umer and Pooja, so do mind the jumping back and forth with the audio. One more thing, next week we're going to be releasing an episode with the judges from Bhangra at the Alamo, aka Bata. So if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening so that you can get it as soon as we drop. And with that, let's jump into it.
Anyway, so to get started, what were your expectations going into Nachde Nashville?
I think that not that long before Nashville, I judged ECS, and I think like one of the things that I was really pleasantly surprised after ECS was that I felt like teams set the bar pretty high in terms of just like showing that collegiate teams, especially right now, have a lot of like creativity and kind of milling about in their brains and looking for places to put it in their sets, and that was really promising. I think that I was looking for a lot of that, and I also expected, which I think did end up being the case, a lot of teams were going to be using Nashville as like a springboard for a blowout. So was expecting to see a lot of sets that had really been like worked on quite a lot, had been iterated on, and should be hopefully pretty close to what you would want to present as a final product for your season.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Was really looking forward to Nashville, especially because I was supposed to judge a couple years ago, and got canceled like right before COVID. But I was super excited to see the teams after like a proper, semester and a half of training. And yeah, it was a solid show.
Okay, so that was the expectation. Was that the reality of the situation?
I think that the spread was pretty big across the board in terms of like the performance of the teams and how well they did on different categories of the rubric. I will say that like of the teams going to blowout, a lot of them like did do quite well against that rubric, so that was really great to see. I think that Nashville is also a competition that rewarded creativity, and like they, when we spoke to the board as judges ahead of time, they said they want to place a greater emphasis on risk taking and creativity than maybe other competitions do. And so definitely saw a lot of that creativity I was talking about in ECS, where like people just throwing things out there, seeing what's stuck. And I
Right.
think that's always on a Nashville rubric. It's better to do that than play it safe. So it was good to see people doing that.
So what is
Yeah, one thing that stuck out to me was like a lot of these teams had much better stage presence than like I was expecting. Like a lot of these dancers are like really showing how much they love the dance, and like that was super refreshing to see. Especially because like I wasn't going into it expecting that level, so it was really nice.
what is the Nashville rubric? And also not only what is the Nashville rubric as in what is on the breakdown, but what did the competition communicate to you guys as judges?
The Nashville rubric had 15 points for creativity of choreography and 15 points for creativity and formation. So those were broken out to separately equally weighted categories. There was also 10 points for cohesion, 10 points for risk, 10 points for sync, 10 points for energy and presence, and 10 points for form. So all of those things were each weighted 10. And I should have broken that down. Cohesion and risk were under set design, whereas sync, energy, presence, form, as well as formation, execution, and Nachde were weighted 5 and 10
Interesting.
respectively. All of those were under technical elements, and then there was an additional 10 points for overall impression.
Yeah, I've never seen Nachde actually in a rubric before. That's interesting. It's new.
I think it's not usually kind of sectioned out into its own category. A lot of times it's in with energy and presence. Um, but that was something the committee wanted as like their own category that they wanted us to judge separately and assign points to separately.
Interesting. So it is 50 points artistic, creative, artistic, 45 technical, and then 10 for overall impression. So it seems like it's slightly leaned. Like if I think about it, is it well? Let me. I look at this rubric and I see artistic plus wow factor is 60 points, and then technical elements is 45. Is that what the competition committee communicated to the whole judges panel? And what were your takeaways in terms of what a first place team would look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is what was communicated to us. Like we went through a couple iterations of this rubric, and ultimately the committee wrote the rubric and assigned the points. But part of the iteration process was, we first got the rubric from them and we just kind of were like, hey, like what you're saying does not match what's on these point values here, right? So the first iteration was just like, what do you guys want from a first place team, right? And they said they obviously want like to see good dancing, and I think that's important. But the most important thing for them was that people try new things and be risky, and they wanted to promote creativity the same way that like people think of Cleveland or Bruin as promoting creativity on the larger circuit. They wanted to have that kind of identity as a comp within the collegiate circuit specifically, because they are a collegiate comp. So that was, I think, what they were heavily leaning towards. At the same time, I think, the reason it's 60 points versus 45 points and not like, 75 points versus 25 points is because I think that they understood that there was a certain number of technical elements, that they're called here, that you can't really not put on a rubric. Like you can't really not put formation execution on a rubric, but it's not the thing that they were most concerned about. So it's on there, but it's like 5 points as opposed to like the 15 that would go into the actual creativity of the formations. So, I'm not going to go through every single point, but roughly that was kind of what went into structuring this rubric, and where you add some points, take away points, and the committee decided this is how they wanted to go with it. And yeah, judges were aware of that. We went through the process with them.
Yeah. So UNC, won. It seemed like they were a slight cut above everyone else, and some of the remarks were focused on set design. What stood out in regards to UNC set design versus everyone else?
I think the thing is that, like, again, if you look at the scores, every judge had them a little differently, but UNC was like towards the top of the lineup for everybody. If you look at everyone's scores on the whole, UNC came out ahead in formation creativity specifically, and then cohesion. In terms of my own scores, UNC did score highest by like a tiny bit when it came to that first section of creativity between choreo and formations. But like they didn't have the highest when it came to like the set design. They were up there, but they weren't the highest. I believe for me, Georgia Tech had beat them out, and I think Birmingham did too. I have to look at my scores a little more closely here. But I think what stood out was specifically that. It was like their formations. The reason that they came out ahead there was because that they had put a lot of thought into like coming up with different formations that, we either hadn't seen before. I think the other thing to note here is that on the rubric, creativity of formations specifically has like a note in there on the rubric about like, did formations enhance choreography, right? So I think for me, that was one thing that stuck out with UNC, is it really felt like the choreo and formations went together really well. And this is a really common thing that like you see collegiate teams struggling with. They go through the process a lot of times, especially newer captains, of making choreo separately from formations and trying to kind of retroactively stick them together. And that doesn't always work, doesn't always flow very well.
I would say UNC put on a really well-rounded performance in Nashville. In terms of creativity specifically, I don't think there's something that made them particularly unique in my eyes or set them super far ahead in terms of set design. think I had Georgia Tech right up there as well. Like they weren't so far ahead in that aspect. I think, they had some cool move variations. They built really nice moments, but it was really their execution that went hand in hand with their set design that put them at the top at this competition.
I would say that the reason that they won, even though this is a more creative competition, they won because they had the most poise, most composure, and like best overall, top to bottom. Their execution was the best overall.
Okay. Conversely, it seems like some teams may have been boring. Like BBB may have been boring.
I don't think the BB was boring. I think they actually scored pretty well, especially if you look at like the judges overall. Like they got number 1 in risk, and they were, I think, 3rd in choreo creativity. So, in terms of like how enjoyable their set was, it depends on like what you're talking about, but like which particular category. But again, like them being boring or not boring is not really the point, right? It's like that's you start talking about like as an audience member, how enjoyable was BBB's set. As an audience member, I had a lot of fun watching it, but like that's not my job that night. My job is not to sit in the audience and enjoy it. My job is to score it. And so I think on this rubric, like I said, risk, they came away with like a lot of points there. They did really well. I do think that, I mean, look, if you look at the scores, there is the same like 4 or 5 teams clustered in and out of like the top 3 in all these categories.
Right.
It was just a question of like who did the best in the categories that were weighted the highest on this rubric.
Right.
It was super important to nail those 10 points for risk, right? But, BBB nailed the risk section. And then you look at formation creativity, which was weighted 15 points, not 10, right? And they're a lot further down the list. So on the whole, enjoyable set. But their execution was not up to snuff with, the placing teams.
So BBB, listen, they were great. They had really creative stuff, but like, and I told them this like straight up during the judges meeting. There are too many conflicting personalities on that team for them to place in any competition.
Personalities
like,
as in people or as in like the way they dance?
Dancing, the way they dance.
Okay.
So what I would say is that I specifically remember during Jummer, like there's a black guy, the red guy, and like the yellow guy. Or they're all at the front, but then they're all approaching every single Jummer step differently. So like they're making different faces, they're looking at like different parts of the crowd. They're all like attacking the step differently. And it's like super jarring because I'm just like, oh man, like who am I supposed to be looking at right now? Where am I supposed to be looking at? There's another point where like I can't remember exactly where, but I like just like there's just like, multiple times on my notes I said red chill, red chill, red chill, red chill. Cause like they're not in the front, they're out to the side a little bit, towards a little bit in the middle of stage, and they're like doing some extra head stuff. And I'm just like, dude, you are literally distracting me from the rest of the performance. Like it's not a cohesive performance. And that is what happened a lot with BBB. Again, cool creative ideas, impactful stuff. Like it was a good performance, but because of the fact of how everybody was dancing and from like the BTF dance, it looked like a common refrain I've heard when I was a younger dancer. It's like, I'm here dancing on stage so I can get my BTF shout out from some random person on the internet. Like it looked like everybody was trying to try to get like best dancer, but in trying to do that, they all lost because they were all trying to like get that memorable moment. But it just like worked against the whole performance.
Pooja, yeah, no, that's fair. You don't need to tell me twice. Actually, you might be able to tell me twice. That's definitely been a problem in the past. If you were so speak a little bit more around enjoyability and the maturity aspect. That seems to be really good advice for some teams. What are some other pieces of advice that you'd give to teams that performed?
I think that a lot of teams, when we were at the judges meetings, were asking from the perspective of like either they have like one comp left, like blowout, or they're in the position where they're trying to kind of hand the team off to the incoming captains. And so everyone's very like forward looking with their sets right now. They're like, how can we iterate on top of this? And I think that some of the advice that popped up a couple times, especially in the context of Nashville and blowout, was this idea of like, how can we be more risky? What does that mean to be more risky? And I would say that read your rubrics. I would say read your rubric and understand what's on that rubric over and over again. Judges will see in the pre-comp meeting. We have that meeting and we say, hey, if you have questions, let us know. And people don't ask questions. And like, I get it because I think like, when I was a collegiate dancer, I don't think I knew what those meetings were for, what questions I should ask, because I just thought like, well, this is the rubric. It's already been decided by people who know more about this than I do. Therefore, like, what could I possibly ask them? But I think that like that meeting is not for you to question the judges in terms of like question the competent judges like, knowledge. It's to actually inform your understanding and make sure that you go into this competition with the proper understanding of what these words that we use at every competition mean at this competition. At this competition, for example, just because I mentioned it earlier, I'm going to say it again, right? Like, this competition, formation creativity included how well formations complement choreography. That is not necessarily going to be a point at a different competition. That's not necessarily the category that point's going to fall under a different competition. If you're confused by that, if this is the first time you've seen that, you want to make sure that that is what that, category means. That's what you ask in that meeting. If you want to understand how are risk and creativity defined separately, if you think of them as one thing, but you see in this rubric that they're being, assigned points separately, don't assume that if you do one, you'll get the points for both. Ask and clarify how those things are different. Because I think that was something that we got asked a lot about in judges meeting. And I think that that's like stuff that people want to understand. And I think they deserve to understand. They just
Right.
need to ask before the comp, not after the comp.
Okay, did anyone ask before?
I don't think we got asked any questions about like point values and like, meanings of things on the rubrics. We got asked maybe like one or two questions, if I remember correctly, but a lot of it was just like clarifying like words and like verbiage, but not really asking about design decisions about the rubric. Instead, we get questions like, will you take off points for there being markers? What do you want us to do with the sublogs? And like, listen, those are great questions, especially coming from like, younger teams that are like maybe competing for the first time or like don't really know how, want to make sure that they're doing the right things respectfully and like are, competition ready for all the unexpected things, whatever. I don't think that those are stupid questions. I just think it's not a good use of your time to use a judges meeting for that. That's the kind of stuff that you can like
Right.
hit up someone afterwards, hit up someone before, hit up someone that doesn't have anything to do with the comp. But at the comp judges meeting, you have to ask questions about the comp.
Okay. So what differentiated, I guess, what differentiated the teams? Or maybe the better question is, were there any teams that stood out for not being creative or not taking any risks or being boring?
So the major contention for placings was kind of first and like actually like it was again like I'm gonna reiterate this competition was like super tight. UNC getting 87.75, Virginia Tech getting 86.375, Georgia Tech getting 84.5, and UVA getting 84.375. Top four placings were like a point up, like 2-3 points apart. The lowest then. It was very hard to deliberate between these. And at the end of the day, we went with points because we really couldn't. Like we were at a stalemate.
Exactly.
I think we all agreed that like UNC probably should have gone first. And then it came to second and third, and it was everybody had some combination of Virginia Tech, UVA, and Georgia Tech. So UNC, they would definitely benefit from just. I told them this during the judges meeting too, but it seems like they're bored with their set. That they've done this set multiple times at this point, and so they're kind of coasting the entire time rather than like really turning it on and be like, no, this is a performance. No, we're competing. Oh shit, like we have to like win. And I didn't really see that drive and that like enjoyment of the set or the performance during that. And I think that is probably the one thing that like a lot of viewers will say like, hey man, like UNC was boring. UNC like wasn't that great. But like the thing is, in the day, they were the cleanest. They were probably one of the cleanest teams of the night, and they had the most overall like execution. And so that's what helped them a lot. And so that's what significantly like put them over the other teams. And yeah.
Mhm. I would agree with that. They're very comfortable with their dancing, and that means like they really gotta explode with it at their next comp to lock in that standing. I would say Georgia Tech was solid. They're in a really good position going forward. And Omer, I know you'll have your own
Yeah.
thoughts to add on to this. But their energy, their Josh is like through the roof. It was like a lot of fun watching them. I would just say that that was also a little bit of their downfall because they get super rowdy at times, and that tends to make them look out of control. So working on that cleanliness and move completion aspect of it, synchronization, that's where like their biggest room for improvement is.
Yeah.
That's
Man, I've never heard a team being
Dude,
called
no,
super
like in
rowdy
all
before.
honesty,
That's a
like
first.
one thing I really liked about Georgia Tech, and personally, like I understand like I had differences with from the panel. There's seldom times I look at a team and I'm just like, wow, they got really nice wide during their tamakas. And like I wrote at the end when they did their like they like landed and like dropped in shaw. I was like, oh shit, they're all rectangles. Like I don't see that often, and that got like their basic forms was really, really good. They had a really good energy. What's up?
Wait, say it again. What shapes
They had a
did you
rectangle.
really
They made a
clue in
rectangle
on?
with the chow.
So before
Shut
they
up,
were
man.
square, they became a rectangle.
All
I just
all
want to
rectangles
know,
are
like,
squares. Not all squares are rectangles, or whatever the hell it is backwards, vice versa. Whatever. Point being is that throughout the set, from like beginning to the very end, their form was on point. Now, was it uncontrolled at times? Absolutely. During Kunde, when they're coming to the front, like there's for most of the set, whenever there was like a really hard hitting drop, it's like 1, 2, maybe 3 people coming to the front center. And when like 3 of them are all hitting it like slightly differently, impact's gonna go down, like execution's gonna go down, sync is gonna go down. But nonetheless, I will say that they hit it hard and they hit it really impactfully, and like they had really good range of motion and they looked very strong. And like when we were talking about like Georgia Tech being rowdy, that's what I would say. It was, I think that personally, that was the thing that really set them apart from a lot of the other teams, was just like they were the only team there that that I felt like actually wanted to win.
so when we're touched on BBB already, so maybe I could talk about UVA. Just looking through my scores personally, like I said before, they were just half a point behind Georgia Tech or more.
Not even
Wow.
0.125.
In the average, yeah. But
Yeah.
every category was just slightly weaker than like the other placing teams. Specifically, I would call out creativity and Nakre or stage presence. So like every aspect of it, if they just dialed it up a little more, they, would have blown us away. I enjoyed their set. They're good dancers, and the progress they've made since Berg was like unreal. So really looking forward to what they bring out at the next one.
Yeah. For UVA, like when I do like 0.125 overall average is so damn small. Like it's hard for me to say like that's the one reason why you lost at all. But I can tell you specifically like some stuff that I wrote down. Like they had some cool moments. Like they had this like whole like guitar session in the middle of the mall. They did like an air guitar. Like they had like cool ideas and stuff like that. But I think personally for me, what really killed it for them is probably their end segment. Like everybody was dying and everybody's legs were arms were just dropping. And like you can't let the last impression on the judge to be you dying, because that's like, and I think they asked like during the judges meeting like what are pet peeves, and I specifically said like, yo, don't die at the end of your set, like that's not unacceptable. And yeah, like there's like, if I watch performance again, I could probably go through like a bunch of things, but overall like they just it is hard for me to tell you what exactly is going to get you that 0.125 points.
Yeah,
You know?
but I don't know if it's really about that, right? It's not so much about like the individual points in the rubric. It's like more meta than that, right? Like, did Virginia Tech resemble a team that would do well on this rubric in comparison to everybody else? And the answer is yes, they did, but it was what they did
Because
what are some things as a team, like what are some pieces of advice you give to a team maybe during the judges meeting or some other spaces to drive greater clarity as to how they should build their sets and actually be successful?
this is something I said to a few of the teams, because there were some teams like I'll call out BBB as an example of this. They had really cool ideas. I think I had them as one of the more riskier and creative teams of the night. But the thing is that like there is, and I think, and Sid said this during the NDC podcast, and I think, and I agree with him when he says this, is like there is a level of creative, like execution required to sell a lot of creative ideas. So, and there's a certain threshold you need to have. So, if you aren't a certain level of cleanliness, it doesn't matter how creative your ideas are. Like
Very fair.
they won't get through. And I think a few of the teams at this competition got hurt because of that, because their execution wasn't there. Then the impact, like I wasn't able to fully understand what was going on stage, and because I wasn't able to fully understand going on stage, I can't give you points on creativity. I can't give you points on impact, and I can't give you points on cohesion. And so, yes, have your creative ideas. It's awesome to have those creative ideas, but at the same time, you got to remember, like, I need to be able to understand it the first time I'm watching it. And if your execution is sloppy enough to the point where it's ambiguous, you're losing. And I think that's what I would say to a bunch of the teams tonight. And again, that's what people might be like weirded out by UNC winning again with a like what they might consider a boring set. But the thing is that I can only give points to performances, to segments, to ideas that I can understand on the first time watching.
Yeah, and going off of that too, like what successful teams are able to do is have something that is a defining moment in each segment. Every segment, has a purpose and leaves an impression in its own way, whether that be, a memorable drop or like a really cool formational mechanism or just plain and simple good dancing, Josh, Nakra. Whatever it is, like each segment builds up that team's identity, and that's what successful teams were able to do at this comp. So that's what I would tell teams to try to focus on, is like have every segment mean something, have even every move, everything you do should be part of this overall puzzle.
What would you say to people who are dancing out there to get them picked as best dancer?
Dude, shut up. No, it's like, listen, I never care. I'll be totally honest with you. I'm usually like, somebody else will say something and then and I'll just get like, yeah, sure, go for it. I never care about best dancer. Oftentimes, if you're the best dancer if you get picked as best dancer, it was because you stuck out a little bit and you were like really, really good on like a bad team. And so therefore, or like your team was like kind of like out there. So yeah, because if theoretically, like if your team is really, really good 1 to 12, you guys all kind of like stick together cohesively, and you're not gonna be like super, super memorable as like a single dancer because you're a part of a unit. If you get picked, so I don't know. I never really care. I wouldn't put a lot of stock into like saying like it's hype if you got best dancer, like congratulations. I'm not trying to shit on you at all, but like I think people
Tell them how you really feel.
listen. I don't know judges who like really spend a lot of time picking best dancer. Like it is an afterthought 5 minutes once placings are done.
I'd agree. There's a lot to focus on in that limited time that I was saying. So it really just comes down to who left an impression, who were your eyes drawn to, more than a few times, and who was able to captivate that attention amongst all the different things that you're juggling during that time. So, they might not have the best crowd of the night or like then the Sangha or whatever it is, but as a package, like who caught your eye? And again, a lot of the best dancers I know personally like have never won this award, but you're still sick. So if you win, great, congrats. But if you don't, you're still sick.
In 2 to 3 sentences, a short summary of the team that won Nachde Nashville, what would it be?
I think even though Nashville was a comp that weighted risk and creativity more heavily than technical elements, the winning team outdanced other teams and scored more points in the technical portion of the rubric, where they made up the points that they lost to other teams in artistic elements and set design.
Fascinating. It's funny that it always ends up working out that way.
It doesn't. It didn't work out that way at Cleveland.
Oh. Wow.
That's really what they talked about on that podcast, right? And I think that was like, anyone who hasn't listened to that podcast needs to listen to that podcast, because obviously like everyone's really interested in the drama from like Cleveland, but more than that, they gave such a good breakdown of just like what goes into a rubric. I know we've talked about the process of judging on this podcast more than once before, but they broke down the NDC rubric so well and went, category by category and explained for everyone's benefit, not just the teams there, what goes into deciding what gets scored in what way. And yes, every comp is going to be different. They're not all going to be like Cleveland, but to your point just now about like, how would a team that like danced really well but didn't score the best in artistic sections win at an artistically weighted comp? Well, this is how, because that's the way the split was. That's not going to be the case at a comp like NDC. They didn't make the rubric that way. That's also probably not going to be the case at a comp like Blowout. Or sorry, not Blowout, Bruin. At Bruin doesn't weight the rubric that way either. But when you have a 50-50 split or a 60-40 split, and it's not just that, like, to be clear, UNC did not like blow everyone out of the water with their dancing. They just won by enough.
Yeah.
And the thing is that when you go into deliberation and everyone has on their score sheets the same team as first place by points, what is there to deliberate?
Right.
Because now if everyone has scored to the rubric, which we discussed, and everyone had the same understanding of what the points meant, then on this rubric, everyone has given the same team first place. That does not go to a deliberation then in our case, because no one had a good reason to knock UNC out of first place other than what? We didn't feel like it. We didn't feel like they, were the most creative team of the night. No, we didn't, but they got the points.
That makes sense. Hey, as a judge, when you look at competitions like Nachde Nashville and you hear some of the feedback and, some of the criticism, right or wrong, what are some things, or what is a thing that you could see improved as part of the overall judging process?
The biggest thing that determines whether a team is mad at the end of the night isn't always the judging results, but it is how it's communicated to the teams. And further clarification and communication between judges and teams is always going to help that. Because personally, like I've given teams like brutal news judging, but I'm usually always able to tell them like, hey, listen, like this is exactly where on the rubric, this is why it happened, and this is what you need to improve. Whenever I explain that, most people are like fine with it afterwards. So any way to do that, that's great. Whether that's like, I personally, like, I pretty much give everybody like, yo, please, like, you know, hit me up and DM me, like, we'll set up a time to talk. Like, I'm more than happy to. I know, like, one of the BBB kids, I've like been helping him with his form for the past like a year and a half. Just like, he'll like send me like, hey, can you like check my Tamaka and see if this is cool? And I like, whenever I get some time, I do that. So like, you can hit up people who are in the circuit and ask. But yeah,
I think that, you know, one thing that I've been thinking about, that I listened to the Cleveland podcast, and I think that one thing that was cool that it sounds like, you know, they did when they had their judges meeting was that they kind of preemptively ran down the rubric and said, this is why we broke everything out into everything that we did. I don't know if that's always possible, because honestly, boards don't always let judges either be as much of a part of the process or don't give them as much heads up. NBC was good that way, where judges had like a lot of time and were very much part of the process. But yeah, I would think that especially with younger competitions and younger teams, I think giving teams like a little bit of help off the bat before the comp and just kind of letting them know, like, yes, we put this rubric in your hand. Just to be clear, this is what the rubric means. This is what it's looking for. So to kind of preempt some of that, which does put a little bit of onus both on judges and boards. I think that's really important to remember too, that like competition boards are a huge part of this and are a much stronger force in these decisions than people realize. Not in the judging itself, obviously, but just in terms of like deciding what kinds of sets and what kinds of points values are going into this stuff. Like that is not on judges most of the time. That is on the comp.
Oh, we're done.
Oh, I think, yeah, dude, most of my complaints are not about the judging process right now, right? I think, okay, I think the other thing that's just like
connected tissue between organizers, their judges to teams. Straw that vertical integration. Someone mentioned on Instagram, we need verticalized integration of everything for success. No, I'm kidding. It's the actually.
I think hearing a lot of the feedback about like, oh, this team got robbed, this team should have placed, whatever it is. Like, I think, you know, the podcast that comes out after these comps now is like hugely helpful. I think because it helps people understand that like it stops making judging like a black box where you just get an answer and you just have to live with it forever. Right. To be clear, the teams do not have to live with it forever and just never get any answers. They can reach out to us. They do reach out to us. I've already spoken to teams from Nashville since, you know, being at the comp. So that line of communication is not closed to teams. Right. Now, to people in general who are watching the competition and have their feelings about it, I get it. I do. I have been in those shoes many, many times where, you know, I didn't necessarily agree with the placings. But I think if you talk to pretty much any judge, most of them will say this, that like when they started judging, they realized how different it is to watch a competition as a judge, as an audience member. Your brain is just completely looking at it from a different perspective. And so, you know, to say like, oh, the judges messed up. The judges don't know what they saw. The judges didn't judge to the rubric. Unless you have the rubric in front of you and you looked over that rubric and you practiced on that rubric, that's not really necessarily true or fair. Yeah. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying like, hey, well, you know, I know this team won, but I thought this team was the best. Or I thought, you know, I enjoyed this performance the most, whatever it was. But that's different because that's subjective. And what judges are trying to do is they're trying to take a subjective thing like an art form and they're trying to make it objective on this rubric. The same exact competition, the same lineup on the same night with a different rubric can produce different placings. It shouldn't produce different placings with different judges, at least not by too much, especially if everyone's judging to the rubric. There's obviously some fudge factor because people notice different things. People, you know, have different experiences and styles. But like, if you're judging to a rubric, you're going into a rubric. It has nothing to do with the judge themselves. I think that's something that's like severely misunderstood. And I don't think it's people's fault, really. I think, people are making personal attacks on judges. That's on them. And I hope you find some peace. But people who are saying that, oh, I don't understand how judges could have seen this or that or come to some conclusion. I get it. It's confusing. But, it's confusing because you don't have the same rubric in front of you going through the same process of watching the competition the judges are.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Bhangra Podcast. If you like the episode, the best way to help us out is to share this with a friend. Also, next week, we will be having the judges from Bhangra at the Alamo, so if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening so you can get it as soon as we drop.